I'm Margaret Galvan. I'm the moderator of this panel, and I have some very exciting luminaries around me who are just going to give some short introductions of themselves before we get started.
My name is Justin Hall. I've been making comics for a while now. I edited a big collection for Fantagraphics called No Straight Lines, 4 Decades of Queer Comics. It's a big kind of collection of a lot of LGBT cartooning. I did a series called True Travel Tales, another Glamazonia, another gay porn comic called Hard to Swallow with Dave Davenport. I teach comics at the California College of the Arts, and I'm a geek, a gay geek. So, yeah.
My name's Edie Fake. I have done a few mini-comic series, including the series Gaylord Phoenix that was collected by Secret Acres in 2010. And they are just releasing my next book called Memory Palaces, which is a series of kind of reimagining queer culture in Chicago.
My name is Nichols. I've been doing comics for a while now. I guess like most recently I've been working on this book called Flocks that I've been doing like chapter by chapter and serializing it. It's about it's a memoir about growing up queer in the South in different ways. Wasn't very fun, but yeah, so that's me.
I'm Howard Cruse. I sort of came up through the underground comics movement in the 70s and then edited the early issues of Gay Comics series, which was underground series, then did a comic strip called Wendell about a set of gay friends during a lot of the 80s, and then during the 90s I spent 4 years drawing my graphic novel Stuck Rubber Baby, which was printed in 95, and in gathered among this, any of us were assassinated during this, you'll understand. And then among those, I have been I'm no longer broadcasting. Okay, is this good? Is this good? Does it sound good? Can be heard? No. Okay, here we go. Here we go. All right, we'll see how we do here. Among doing all of this comic book stuff, I did, humorous illustration and mainstream illustration and short comic strip pieces for various places over the years, and that's sort of where I am now, doing short things, having basically decided that I don't have the stamina to do another graphic novel.
Okay, great. I brought a few images today that are not at all like broadly representative, but I figured they could be some talking points, and they're things that have already been mentioned. So we have some early work by Howard Cruse. So if you want to jump in on any of these.
Well, that's from a strip called Billy Goes Out, which is about during the period in the late 70s when there was sort of sexual freewheeling in New York, and it was before the epidemic sort of surfaced and made it far more difficult to have fun hooking up constantly. And this is about the interior life of a guy as he goes through an evening out on the town in the New York gay subculture.
It is the most cutest anthropomorphic penis I've ever seen. I'm just saying. Props.
And it was in the first issue of Gay Comics, is that right?
That's true.
And so here's the second issue cover, which I chose since you illustrated the cover. Right. And I thought it was a good sort of illustration of the community that was sort of, you were trying to create and sort of collecting different sort of queer artists together sort of for the first time.
Right. We wanted the book to be co-gender. It was important not to be just a gay male thing. And fortunately, several lesbian and bisexual friends of ours jumped in. And bit by bit, other people surfaced, and the Gay Comics series passed a long time after I quit editing it. I forget how many years, but a lot of years under 2 subsequent editors.
Like 25 years, I think?
Yeah, something like that.
I think it was 25 issues in 18 years.
Oh,
Yeah.
Is that what it was? Mm-hmm. But this is, about, during that period when there's all this talk about can you cure homosexuals with negative reinforcement and stuff like that.
So then we're jumping forward to the mid-'80s. Wendell was a strip that you did throughout the '80s in The Advocate. This is actually not from The Advocate. This is from Gay Comics as well, in color. Sort of, it's just lovely, I think.
Yeah, this was about the use of family as a code word for anti-gay sentiments that was very popular in the political culture of that time.
And then the last image, just sort of to get started off, is from your recent or semi-recent work, Stuck Rubber Baby. And so it's just a great sort of retrospective, looking back, looking forward moment of coming out or realizing sort of there's this moment.
Yeah, this graphic novel was reflective of my experience growing up in Alabama during the civil rights era and coming out during that period and being a conflicted gay guy who was trying to be straight during that period. And a lot of different currents were sort of interwoven in the book.
Yeah, and so then I jumped from there, and this is just, the intro to everything, to Elle Nichols' work. And I have about 4 panels from the beginning of Phlox, which you were just talking about.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been working on Phlox for, I guess, 2 years now. I don't know. I lost track of time. And yeah, I've just been focusing on like the themes of queerness and spirituality and like how those have changed throughout my life and in different groups I've found myself in. So it's starting like, in this like very like Southern Baptist, I was raised Southern Baptist and like being very conflicted. And chapter 4 that I'm working on now is actually about school and about how like, like whatever group I was in, there was always something that wasn't quite right about whatever I was, like it didn't fit in. So like trying to take this idea of queerness and expanding it to like other life experiences, I guess, is what I've been trying to do with it.
Yeah, so we just have a few panels in the beginning. They're just sort of really highlighting this point,
Yeah.
sort of intensity around this issue.
Yeah, I also say like I studied engineering, and so like science and math are like a big part of my understanding of the world, and so I frequently have like arrows and equations and stuff in my work. So if you're ever wondering where that came from, that's that.
And then this one is great. So this, you can see these two are sort of back to back, and you can see how there's this transference of one sort of moment into that's sort of like in a surreal scape into sort of a real moment as well, which then, as an introduction, transferred me over to your work in Gaylord Phoenix, which is very, very surreal. So I just have a few panels of this.
Yeah, I feel like Gaylord Phoenix ended up, or maybe even started, with being sort of a psychedelic approach to gender and sexuality, where the kind of like the ultimate fluidity of bodies and sexuality is sort of on display with a lot of decadence. The book definitely gets more decadent as it goes forward, and this is the line work from a panel towards the end of it.
And then there's another panel from this. And then I have, if you want to talk about memory palaces, I haven't seen the book yet, but the images I'm seeing online are really wonderful.
Oh yeah, so the Memory Palace's images started with a series of kind of, I was uncovering like snippets of queer history in Chicago, like hints of bars that had existed and didn't exist anymore, and just kind of like social sites, feminist sites, and then I'm really captivated by the architecture of that city as well, and so it was trying to combine history and the architecture of the present for like something that kind of gave potential to these spaces again. So the Newberry Theater was an old porn theater, and those were movies from a Chicago like sex club and movie production company, the Bijou. And yeah, it was just kind of like uncovering these scraps, and eventually it led to like buildings that were completely kind of my fancy, and also kind of like gateways for people as well.
So then we also have this Killer Dyke, which...
Oh yeah, that was a short-lived newspaper. printed in purple ink, I think, which is, yeah, the images of the newspaper are completely beautiful, and I was wanted to really combine it with Chicago's tile work and kind of ornate decorations.
So it's not just facades of places, but of also sort of a larger.
Yeah, it's like a reimagining of sites to kind of capture the potential of them, rather than like a nostalgia trip being like, oh, what was Killer Dyke? I want it to be like, Killer Dyke could have the office down the street, and it could look like that, you know?
Is there a narrative to the piece, or is it kind of this surreal?
All the pieces are connected in this way, like the kind of ribbony design on underneath them connects them all, and you can build kind of a neighborhood out of them almost. But in terms of like a narrative element, there's not a written narrative. It's more like an envisioning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this idea of neighborhood is an interesting way to sort of reconceptualize ideas of community, which I see it all over your work. And when you're working, Justin, when you're working with people on, like this one, Glamazonia, sort of putting them in the frame alongside you. Can you talk about that?
Well, I used I brought in a lot of other creators on this book as well. So I wrote the whole thing, and I illustrated probably about 2/3 of it, and then brought in other people to illustrate other aspects of it. I wanted to kind of, use kind of poke fun at queer identities and superhero tropes and comic book tropes here. So I brought in a lot of different people with different kinds of perspectives to do different illustrations. And one of the fun things about doing comics is that you get to kind of pack the panels with lots of inside jokes. So I would have, like everything from, having a friend's band on a T-shirt and someone in the background to kind of different kinds of characters and cross-referencing stuff. So that's something that's really fun to do in comics.
So I'm going to show some of your other covers, but I want to show some of your inside work as well. So we have a few sort of panels here.
This was from, there's a really amazing series called Straight to Hell, the Manhattan Review of Unnatural Acts by Boyd McDonald, I think his name was, who he basically is, pre-internet, he basically collected true sex stories, gay sex stories. And it's part jack-off book and part kind of social, social history. It's this kind of amazing thing. So you're kind of like turned on, but then you want to cry, or then laugh. It's kind of this wonderful amalgam of stuff. And there's this incredible story that I read there, and I was like, I have to make a comic out of it, where this guy talks about his abuse at the hands of his partner, who was closeted and couldn't come to terms with his own sexuality, and so he kind of took it out on this guy and beat him. And it's about abuse, basically. So it was a pretty dark story in contrast to some of the other stuff that I do. So.
And this is something newer as far as I understand.
This is a memoir piece. It took me a long time to get to this. I was coming out of, I got involved with a guy who I think now is, looking back, was probably straight man who's probably beginning stages of paranoid schizophrenia, and so he, and I moved to Providence, Rhode Island with him and some other people. So there's, sex, confusion, and heroin. Kind of a great mix of like themes. And rock and roll. So that's. Yeah, doing memoir pieces is an interesting. You're creating a kind of narrative about your own life. Al, you do with us all the time, right? So you're presenting. What happened to yourself, but of course, memory is itself a narrative project where you're kind of constantly imagining your own story as life as a story, and then when you put that down, to take the extra step to put that down into a work of nonfiction. It's another narrative level, if that makes sense. So, for example, I had to combine a couple of characters. Like the woman here is an amalgam of two of my female roommates at the time. But it didn't make narrative sense to have two, right? So I kind of combined them. So when you're approaching your own life as a narrative project, it's this kind of interesting. I don't know if you guys run into this or how faithful. What do you think true is, or your?
I think I started introducing my book as a work of fiction, nonfiction.
Yeah.
Because even my memories, I don't know, they're only my perspective, and who knows how someone is perceiving me.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Maxine Hong Kingston and Audre Lorde. Whoa, hey, okay, hello. Ooh. So Maxine Hunt
Mikey, we'd
Kingston,
lose that time.
Maxine Hunt Kingston and Audre Lorde came up with the concept of automythography, which I always kind of love that term, where you kind of take your life story and kind of make myth out of it. So I don't know.
And even Linda Berry talks about this in her work, like where do you sort of put something if it's sort of true, but parts of it are sort of imagined, or you're sort of putting all these things together. And I think, this work, your anthology, sort of doing research of queer comics over the last 4 decades, sort of is a space where you're trying to create this space for possibility or see what sorts of spaces of possibility have been created. And I was wondering sort of to you, but also broadly to the rest of the comics artists, how the queerness as a community or as a comics community, how that sort of inflects your work when you're working in an anthology, what sorts of, the queer histories in comics sort of come back to your work always. We've already sort of talked about this a little bit, but to have you meditate on that a little bit more.
I was profoundly inspired by putting this book together. It was about 3 years of research, kind of going through everything from the old gay newspapers and magazines like The Advocate that would have gag strips and stuff to the lesbian underground comics of the 70s. Things like what Howard worked on, edited the gay comics series that lasted for 18 years. And then, the dyke punks zines in the 90s, the trans web comics that are coming out now. I mean, there's this, tremendous, and it's international. I mean, there's, and different concepts of queerness and gender that happen, and sexuality that happen across the world. And it's really, to feel like you're part of this kind of larger, broader, paintbrush is really kind of amazing and very inspiring.
Yeah, I think for with looking at kind of queer history, there have always been these kind of touchstone logos or visuals. The visual culture of it is just totally inspiring to my work, and in the language of it, where you'll hit a certain word and I'll be like, oh my God, that needs to come back into queer parlance. Bring it back. Let's Virgo
the
out.
invert.
Yeah. Why not? I mean, but there's a potential in that language, and in the and looking at No Straight Lines and the history of queer comics, there's these kind of modes of drawing queer life that are really striking and beautiful.
For me, I don't know, I feel like I have a weird history because I didn't read that many comics growing up, I didn't have a lot of queerness around me either. And so for a lot of the stuff I end up drawing on are more modern art and experimental comics, or the things I'm often drawing from, and my own autobiographical stuff that I do. And so I was asked to be in the queer comics anthology that just came out, and
I have that.
it's very good. I was really happy to be part of it, but that was the first queer comics thing that I was oh, you should do this. And I'm oh, okay, because I don't know, I feel I was coming at it more from here I'm making comics for a very long time, and only recently did I start making comics that were explicitly about being queer. So I don't know, I feel there's a little bit of a.
I mean, you have sort of a lovely range in aesthetics. We were talking about gardening, and then all this, there are these math symbols. But I feel there's something really queer about how you're looking at people.
Yeah, and so I mean, I feel with Phlox that I'm working on, what I'm trying to tie into is how yes, there's this part of me that's queer, and really that's the part that no matter where I am, that's always with me. Type of thing. So it's where whatever group I happen to be in, there's some part of me that's why are you doing this? This is not what I agree with, or I'm never quite in any group fully, and I feel that is the part of me that feels very queer. I don't know. It comes out in my work probably by the fact that I do a bunch of different stuff.
Yeah.
Well, it's just interesting that we all feel comfortable calling this a queer comics panel, and the word queer has a long history in which, it's an example of a word being reclaimed, which was once so hurtful. And, many, as a matter of fact, when queer was always something that was used sort of ironically within the gay community. I mean, it was used by fag bashers and people like that to spew hate, but it was used within the gay subculture ironically, because to take some of the sting out of it and to use it amusingly, but it was something that it was shocking when it emerged because of the formation of Queer Nation. Suddenly it was out, in the streets as a political word, and for me, it felt startling and yet kind of natural for it to make that transition, because it was not as if we never used the word ourselves before. It's just that we used it in secret among ourselves, and suddenly it was there. Just talking about the relationship between history and the comics that that I did. Gay comics was, we sent out the solicitation letter looking for contributors to gay comics basically 10 years after the Stonewall riots. And at that time, it was the big question in my mind, and the question of many young cartoonists' mind, was, is it possible to both be openly gay and have a mainstream cartooning career? And this was very important to me because I wanted to be a mainstream cartoonist. I didn't want to just be forced to deal with only one topic all my life. And there were a lot of cartoonists who had found forums in gay newspapers or alternative newspapers. And gay comics was the opportunity for them to reach a larger national audience in something that was a project of substance that was not just about campiness and sleaze. And, in our audience, as a matter of fact, is Jennifer Camper, who was one of the immediate contributors to gay comics and had been drawing stuff for the Boston gay papers. Am I correct about that, Jennifer? And, so she was somewhat, on the fringe, and the gay comics gave her a chance to emerge somewhat from that fringe, and bit by bit, as gay comics was discovered by larger audiences, including eventually some straight audiences, it was a way that basically we could say, hey, rather than thinking of ourselves as somewhat sleazy beings, which you were really encouraged to do in the 50s and 60s, we are, there's a wholesomeness, there's a healthiness to the gay community, and I was in a particularly good position to make that statement because my natural style was a friendly cartooning style. And so I was able to sort of bring that, hey, we're fully rounded people.
That being said, I'm proud to be sleazy also. So.
Well, it was important to me, particularly coming from the underground comics world. It was very important for, sexiness to be incorporated within the, within the totality of human experience, which it is in the real world. And it's only in, sort of the Puritanism of the American culture that it's often shunted off, in this special category of porn. But in the gay world, people were, had all the different facets of life, but meanwhile they would go out and have wonderfully sleazy sex.
Yeah, we're sort of in a very different period today. And you, Justin, you reflect on this in No Straight Lines at the beginning, where you say, it remains the job of mainstream comics to assimilate LGBTQ characters, while it falls to queer comics to dissect queer identities, examine in more profound ways the queer experience. So I'm wondering, where, along those lines, sort of where does your work sort of fit into the sort of mainstream, not mainstream, queer, something sort of broadening out in various ways? Over the past few decades.
I do feel that I'm thrilled that there's a lesbian Batwoman and there's a gay Archie character that's fantastic. And in the past, if you had a queer character in a comic, it was necessarily a queer comic because there was just no space for those kind of characters or themes in the mainstream at all. The exception, Doonesbury had a character, right? There were occasional exceptions, but basically it was, Jim Shooter in the 1980s said there are no gays in the Marvel universe. Boom, that's it. So there, any comic that had a queer was a queer comic. Now that's not true, thank God. But I still think that there's a need for queer comics that can kind of talk about these experiences from an insider's perspective. And that doesn't mean that the queer comics need to be made by queer creators, because I think that, you know, I have some people in No Straight Lines that, like Trina Robbins, Joyce Farmer, who are straight people, straight cisgender people who talk about queer experiences from very much an insider's perspective. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be queer, but kind of speak from, you know, from a knowledgeable perspective.
Yeah, Edie and Ella, I was wondering sort of how your work sort of, this sort of new generation sort of fits into this.
Well, I mean, I feel like when I started making comics, I knew that I just writing or drawing autobio, which is such a foundation point of queer comics, it seems, didn't appeal to me, because there's also an aspect of it which I think you touched upon with the kind of like the myth aspect of autobio, but something about talking about myself seems to strip the power from the stories in this way. And so it was kind of trying to figure out a way to like capture a certain sleaziness and like a certain reality in a form that was fantastical. Like finding that fantastical was a way to touch on what I was feeling and how I was remembering things in a way that wasn't autobiographical at all, but kind of sort of caught the power of my community. So I guess like looking at queer comics in a way that like sort of combined the fantasy worlds from comics that I really adored and loved, and creating characters that were like almost out of thin air but reflected the reality of a queer situation.
And I guess with me, like, I started with autobio, I guess, like, opposite of you. But, like, I don't know, I really enjoy doing autobio comics. There's just, like, my gardening comics, or I'm walking the dog. And, yeah, sure, maybe, like, my wife appears in them, and, like, it's no big deal. 'Cause, like, for me, like, you know, it isn't. Like, I live my life. And it's a pretty normal life, I guess, normal. I mean, there's nothing exciting about it. I'm not like, there's no like mysterious like queer world that I live in. I live in New York, and I like biking. I don't know. So like, I enjoy like showing a queer, like that type of lifestyle. It's like, you know, this is nothing to fear. Like I'm just a person, here's my life.
Yeah, but I think that's sort of key, the dailiness of it. I mean, in the most of the lesbian history archives, which is in Brooklyn, their photo collection is mostly comprised of a photo drive in the 80s where they asked women all across the U.S. to like send in their photos, and a lot of them are of their like dogs or their cats or things like that. So I think this dailiness is really important in a queer experience.
No, and I would say also, like, I feel like a lot of the people who read my comics aren't queer, or like aren't like, you know, like queer. And so like for that, like I think it's kind of like, you know, my father-in-law reads them, or like, you know, my relatives, and or like my brother, for example, he like read Phlox and like called me up and was like, you know, I found this really moving, I love you. And so I think like that's really nice, is that like I have this audience of people who maybe, you know, that didn't think about this but like read them and did. I think that's really nice. And I find it very touching whenever I have people tell me that.
I mean, how do you think you're sort of communicating to the queer experience when it's like going to a reader that's perhaps unexpected, or?
Well, I feel like, well, if I'm communicating my experience, like I can't help but have it be a queer experience, because I am who I am. And I don't know, I feel like if you reach out on a personal level, people are more likely to respond. People respond to people with sincerity, and like that's typically been what I've experienced, is like if I'm very honest and sincere about what I do, people tend to respect it. And
I think we need the freedom to be fabulous, but also the freedom to be mundane.
yeah.
I always tried, you know, in my Wendell comic strip in particular, one of the missions of that strip was to to look at the everyday life that people lead through a humorous prism, which, you know, if we have senses of humor about ourselves, is a kind of natural way to look at things. We're all involved in things that have a certain level of absurdity to them, including our efforts to be socially responsive and to be activists to the extent that we do that. And this was kind of necessary to be activists during the 1980s because there was a concerted homophobic effort coming from the government and from the religious right. And so just out of sheer self-protection, gay people had to, take to the streets and organize and resist that kind of thing. But meanwhile, they still had to do the laundry and they still had to deal with their romances and all of those things. And, everything about life has a certain comedic side. So, very little of my stuff has been pure autobiography, but all of it has drawn from my life experience.
What about when there's huge tragedies? Like, I remember talking to Robert Tripto about who was the second editor of Gay Comics, and he does all humor comics, and when he was dealing with multiple funerals every weekend from the AIDS crisis, he stopped making comics for a while. Did you ever?
It took me a couple of years to figure out how to incorporate the AIDS epidemic into Wendell. Because I was aware, particularly, Wendell was appearing in a national gay news magazine, The Advocate. I knew that a large number of the readers of that magazine, this was not anything abstract. This was life and death for them, and they were dying. They were seeing their friends dying. They were suffering. And I was very concerned not to trivialize their experience by taking it lightly in any way. On the other hand, when I decided I can't avoid this indefinitely because Wendell was supposed to be about the lives we're leading, and so I made a point to spend more time with people who, were living with HIV, and I found that many of them had great senses of humor about the experience. There was something quite wonderful and bracing about the way they were meeting the challenge. And some of these people who, had no background in science were like experts on pharmaceuticals. I mean, they just knew all the meds, and they would compare notes, and they had a very mordant senses of humor about the experience of facing mortality. And so I found a way in by having, a couple of central characters who were HIV positive in the strip. But it wasn't all about death. It was about survival.
From there to now, it strikes me how many sort of spaces for queer comics have been over the last few decades, not just the ones I'm showing here, but it seems like almost every year there's another anthology or another anthology, and they're very, they embrace these sorts of wide varieties of perspectives, and yet there's still space for them as we're still in a sort of mainstream moment, but not so mainstream. And so I want to think where are we going from here with queer comics? Where is your work going? I'm sure everyone's interested to know. So if you could reflect a little bit on that. Anyone?
I'm doing a graph. When I finished No Straight Lines, I was I was a little burned out on the subject, so I was jokingly talking about how I was going to do an all het comics, but actually, so I'm writing a series set in the pot industry in Northern California that ends up, it has one trans character. Otherwise than that, it's not particularly queer. But then I'm doing a graphic novel, and it just got gayer and gayer and gayer and gayer. And so now it's pretty damn gay. It's set in the porn industry, which I dealt with for a while. It's got a gay ghost. It's all this a future queer that where gender and sexuality is completely fluid, and you can change it at will, that kind of stuff. So. I guess the future of queer comics. I think that queer identities keep on fracturing and evolving in really fascinating ways, and I love that. So let's and I still want comics made about that, because comics are such a kind of visceral. Artistic language that is visual and verbal, and it can and it's DIY, and it can get at these kind of things faster and in a more nimble fashion than almost any other medium. So I think there's this tremendously exciting history and future for queer comics.
I guess personally, I feel like almost like the legacy of like gay history, queer history, it leaves me with these like kind of feeling like I have like deep veins of love and fury to deal with, and so I feel like I don't necessarily know the plot of any comic I'm making when I start it, but try to navigate in through those emotions that kind of feel like almost like the like the weight of like heavy love and like this like heavy history of like violence and fear and just like trying to come to terms with my own identities and also to to like make something real that really I guess rather than like I often like kind of ignore the mundane, or it will be like a kind of like a just like a establishing detail to my work for when something outrageous happens, because I think that's what lasts in my memory about my life, and also like tapping into those kind of those veins in my brain and seeing what comes of that and what visually sort of bubbles to the surface, and like a comic is basically like sorting that out and almost like problem solving therapy for me or something.
That's the best title, like Deep Veins of Love and Fury. There's the title, man. That's awesome.
Me, I'm mostly focusing on working on Phlox. I finished 3 chapters. I'm most of the way through chapter 4 right now, and I think it's probably going to be about 9 chapters when I'm done. So that's like, I don't know, each one's like 33 pages, so you can do the math. So I've just been like trying to work on it, and in doing so, I don't know, try to figure out like where I am in my life right now is really good and happy, but like there was a lot of struggle to get there, and so I feel like it's mostly just me trying to like sort through that. Like that's what I've been using the comic for, is sorting through that. So like when I'm working on it, I like whatever feeling I'm dealing with in the comic, like I have to live it again, which my poor wife has to put up with me when I'm like grumpy or like I've found that the worst part is when I'm working on these like very mixed feelings of like, especially dealing with churches for me, because like in Southern communities they're very important for like community ties. Like they supported my parents when they got divorced. Like there were a lot of good things that came out of them, and also a lot of really horrible things. So like trying to talk about mixed feelings just leaves me having like a month of like, wow, I feel very mixed about everything. Like I don't know.
Only occasionally does a topic relating to being gay arise that I haven't already covered in between Wendell and Stuck Rubber Baby and the other gay comics that I did, and I don't find it interesting to repeat myself. So, and also just right now, obviously the world has become more accepting of gay people. It's no longer necessarily a conflict-ridden experience. It has, life is a conflict-ridden experience, but being gay is, in itself, is not automatically full of conflict, which means that, it doesn't necessarily, the narratives, I'm beyond the point of being a young person trying to find love. I'm in a relationship, we're hitting our, 35th year, so I'm not out beating the bushes for, a new lover or something. And frankly, the gay things are not the things that are most on my mind, that are most concerning to me. I'm far more concerned about the political paths that our country is taking, and Supreme Court decisions that are outrageous. And there's just a lot of things that get my juices flowing besides gay things. If a new crisis arises around gay people, I'm sure that would be something I would want to address.
Do you guys have any questions for each other?
one comment, just Edie, your Gaylord Phoenix goes into the magical asshole of the like, it's one of the most like resonant. It just sticks in the head. Okay, that's enough.
Oh, good.
It's lovely. I mean, everybody here on this panel is amazing. So it's just, yeah.
It's the best thing to read on the subway. Should we open up to the audience?
Yeah, I got a question, related to comics that, are traditionally mainstream, such as the Gay Lantern, or I said the Gay Lantern. Green Lantern. Oh, that was a great faux pas. So anyway, he's now, they introduced the Green Lantern as a gay character. I just wondered if any of the panelists find this kind of disingenuous, or almost they're trying to pander to shifting attitudes towards gay acceptance and why, more general.
I think it's a positive thing because it does help to, fold in more people into, thinking about gayness as an everyday part of life. It doesn't interest me, as a matter of fact. I feel that something inherently crazy about trying to be realistic at all about the gay experience and have that at the same time you're having costumed superheroes. So I don't find it exciting as something to read, but I do appreciate that it's a lot better than gay people being invisible in the mainstream comic world.
I didn't even know the Green Lantern was gay. Or
One of them.
I know.
I say pander away. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I hope that all of those kind of mainstream universes get more diverse and represent what is really out there. So that there's queer people, there's more female characters, there's people of color. I mean, absolutely, because kids read these books, are inspired by them. I read them when I was a kid. I was inspired by them. And so the more representation you can have, the better. I mean, but again, it's a different project because their project is about assimilation and normalization. It's not going to be about the intricacies of the queer experience. I mean, the Gay Lantern is not going to, have a kind of discussion about, internalized racism in the gay community. Like that's not appropriate, right? So, but we can do that. So, yeah.
I also think that so much of superhero narratives are about unlocking the power of marginalized and oppressed peoples. That is, and people realizing their superpower, and so it makes sense that this kind of diversity gets unlocked. At the same time, I do think that much of it is about last resort marketing, being oh, this is socially acceptable, so let's do it, and it's kind of like a throwaway sell books to the gays kind of thing. So I don't care, pander away, I don't care, but that narrative was there to begin with in this way.
In the back, and then we'll go over here. Yeah.
Don't you just want to be the boogeyman? I mean, do you always want to be folded in? I don't know, but there's a lot of, I feel like we've been talking about the mainstream for 10 minutes. And I kind of like the idea of queer comics getting it in the face of the mainstream. That's something that I think is necessary too. I like the idea of challenging.
Yeah, I mean, hothead paisan homicidal lesbian terrorist is never going to cross over. It's never going to be mainstream, and that's fantastic. And it's the angry id of lesbian comics, and it's this incredible testament to that legitimate, power. And it's not meant for everybody, and it shouldn't be. So absolutely, I mean, some work is always going to be, stick it to the whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I love villains or villainy and general. General mischief and also trouble, and I think that's a big part of queer comics, the rabble rabble-rousing. You know, I think being trouble is a serious part of the identity of queer comics, and it doesn't have to dissipate. Like, keep it sleazy. That's part of, I mean, that's part of my life. So I feel like making it part of art and comics makes sense for me.
Yeah. I find that I am like more on the like not fitting in the mainstream with like making poetry comics or fine art fan comics, which I've done a few of. Which are like in a different sort of way, but it's very much like I'm actively trying to make something that like is not fitting in like the things I see around me, because they're the things I'm interested in, and I want to see that represented in whatever way.
I'm interested in comics that are about the truthful looks at life. And life is not inherently bland, and it's not inherently something that doesn't have scary things in it. So I don't think, you know, I don't think there's anything, when I say, you know, I wanted to move in the mainstream as well, I mean, I wanted to be able to make a living. And I wanted to be a full-time cartoonist. And there's no way you could be a full-time cartoonist only doing underground comic books. It was important to me that the art directors who would hire me to do illustrations for newsstand magazines were not afraid to use me, did not see me as a, you know, some sort of alien being that was too controversial to be on their pages. And it was gratifying that when I finally, you know, came out professionally, that I did not have to sacrifice a lot of mainstream work. But it didn't prevent me from trying to get to truthful cores of life, you know, in my comics. And I don't think it's about, you know, saying, well, therefore I'm going to be bland in order to please everyone in my serious work, which was the comics work.
Over here.
I think this is coming out of Edie's latest project, but I'm wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about how you feel about this sort of disappearance of lesbian and gay bookstores nationally, and the way that those spaces have kind of, you know, vanished as social spaces for people.
So it's honestly one of the reasons I did this No Straight Lines was because you know, traditionally I think queer comics existed outside of the comics world and were really supported by the queer media ghetto. So, you know, gay and lesbian bookstores, newspapers, publishers, and Alison Bechdel was able to make a living making Dykes to Watch Out For and distributing it through gay, you know, newspapers, bookstores, and publishers. And now she can't. You can't make a living that way because there's too few of these things now. So she was able to cross over in the mainstream. Not everybody can. But the danger is that all this material vanishes, just gets lost, and that's really a sad thing. I mean, I'm glad that queer narratives can kind of go throughout the culture now and not just be pigeonholed or ghettoized, but at the same time, when you lose a ghetto, a creative ghetto, there is a loss to that.
I think there's a real importance to physical space, and in kind of like an internet-driven, or with the parallel internet culture, like there's so much of social life that can happen online, but also like the physical power of like having a space that you're dancing at, or a space that you're like browsing in, or like a community center to like just hang out and people watch. Like that is, and I work at a small bookstore that's not explicitly queer, but like focused on small press. And from working there, I realized that, like it was very obvious from like my first day there. I'm like, oh, like small, like, or like just like localized like social spaces in the physical realm are so important as like these like hubs and nodes of activity. So there's a real sadness for like queer bookstores closing, like, and like kind of like the like in Chicago, there's not really like a, I guess like a lesbian bar anywhere, and there's just kind of like decentralized nodes, and so it was a lot thinking about that, like the importance of having physical spaces, and so yeah, I think it's rotten. But also, like, it takes a lot to run a physical resource, and it takes a lot of people realizing that that's a necessary resource to support and be part of.
Honestly, they never played a really big part in my life. I guess I spent a lot of time online, and I always have. Like, we had the internet very early. I guess all things considered, my dad was like really into technology, and so like a large part of my life has been spent on the internet, and so like I always found community there from like a very young age. So like the physical spaces were never that important to me. Also growing up, there weren't any in Louisiana anywhere. Like the nearest comic book store even was like 45 minutes away from where I grew up. So it doesn't really affect my life much, but I can see like how, like, you know, things change. It's, you know, it's sad, but you can't control how things change. And I just hope that, you know, whatever happens out of it is better and stronger and has like, you know, more voices get heard. Yes.
Yeah, when I first came out, gay bars functioned not only as a cruising ground, but as a community center. It was a way to introduce and welcome people who were coming out and to give them a feeling for, you know, how to comfortably experience other gay people. And, you know, there were no gay community centers or anything. And then time passed and there were gay community centers and there were, you know, gay chess clubs and there were gay other things. And, you know, and gay bookstores functioned as another kind of community center. And I do think it's a loss. It's also a loss to lose any kind of small bookstore, gay or not. There's all sorts of ways that the world is changing that I find, you know, turning loose of things that I valued a lot. And I do hope that we can find ways to compensate.
We have time for about one more question.
Oh, thanks.
It's like hard to see, but yeah.
Sorry. This is a interesting question. This is just the one you said before about being the boogeyman type of thing. I have a comic strip with a character in it, and I have, my sister has 3 kids. None of them are, you know, past 10 yet, but yet they're very interested into comics and what I do. How would you introduce like a gay themed comic to a child, and what do you think is like a appropriate age, or, you know, given the fact that, you know, like you said, that, you know, scariness is everywhere. I mean, my nephews and my niece were scared by Coraline. So I'm wondering, you know, what would be a good type of age?
There are all ages queer comics. So, for example, in this book, I've got an example of Christine Smith's *The Princess*, which is about it's a webcomic about a young trans girl and her group of family and friends. There's *The Power Within*, which is published by Northwest Press. It's about kind of kids in school and the kind of queer kids and coming into their own power. So there are all ages queer comics out there.
But if you had to like introduce your comic, because that's what they want to know about my comic, how would you?
I would not show my gay rape, pirate rape comic to any children. That's, you know, there's certain stuff that's age appropriate. So.
Like, you know,
Maybe start like drawing comics with them and just be like, let's draw a comic together and like make up characters with them and just show them how you're working on stuff. Maybe without the, like, if there's explicit content, without that.
Really explicit, but they're just like, mine's a bit confusing because I have a drag queen and a drag king, yet part of the comic in fact is that they don't look like they're dressed like the opposite sex, but the joke is that they don't look like the sex, they aren't really the sex that they're dressed as, and that's part of the confusion in the comic as the joke.
Yeah, why not?
Well, that's yeah, that's fine for kids.
Kids can handle
I mean, kids can handle that. Yeah.
I'm hoping I
Yeah.
can.
No pirate rape. Otherwise than that, you're fine. You get pirate rape. Whoever said that.
They have to sign a waiver first.
Exactly.
Any final remarks, quick questions? Well, thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you.